The soil on Ward Dunbar's grave was still dark and loose. 4 days. That was all the time the world had given Cecilia Dunbar between the moment she pressed the last handful of earth over her husband's chest and the moment she heard the sound of Corvin Vickers' truck climbing the mountain road toward her home. She was standing on the porch when she heard it. Not because she had been waiting, because she had not been able to go back inside. The cabin was still full of Ward in all the ways a place holds a person after they are gone. His coffee mug on the shelf above the stove, his work gloves on the peg beside the door, the particular smell of wood smoke and pine pitch that had been his smell for so long, she could no longer separate it from the smell of the house itself. She had stood on the porch in the October cold and looked at the grave marker at the edge of the tree line, and she had been trying to find a thought large enough to contain what had happened. She had not found one yet. The truck was old and the road was rough, and she could hear the engine laboring up the grade a full 2 minutes before the headlights appeared around the bend below. It was early morning. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge. Frost still clung to the rail of the porch where her hand rested, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air. And somewhere high above the timberline a wind was moving through the pines with a sound like distant water. Cece knew the sound of that truck. She had known it for 20 years, the particular rattle of the rear quarter panel that Corvin had never bothered to fix, the way the engine coughed on steep grades because he ran it lean. She had heard it 100 times coming up this road, always on the occasions when Ward was home and Corvin wanted something. She had never once heard it and thought, he is coming to see how we are. She watched it come. She did not go inside. She did not move from the porch rail. She stood in the cold morning with her hand on the frost-covered wood, and she watched Corvin Vickers park his truck in the yard and get out. And she watched the second door open. And she watched Sheriff Boyd Cutler step down from the passenger side, with his hat already on his head, and his thumbs already in his belt, in the posture of a man who has been told to look official. Corvin did not come to the porch steps. He stopped in the yard. He was 57 years old and built like a man who had spent his life doing the kind of work that kept him strong, without making him careful. Broad through the shoulders, heavy in the hands, with a face that had the particular quality of a man who had practiced looking reasonable for a long time and had gotten good at it. He did not bring flowers. He did not say, "I am sorry for your loss." He reached into the front pocket of his canvas coat and brought out a folded envelope and held it at his side. Cece said, "Ward has been in the ground 4 days, Corvin." She said it quietly, not as an accusation, as a statement of fact, the way a doctor states a condition. Here is what is true. Here is what is present in this room. Corvin looked at her with the patient expression of a man who has arrived prepared. He said, "I know that, Cece. I am sorry for it. But there are things that have to be addressed, and waiting does not make them easier." He held out the envelope. She came down the porch steps slowly, not because her legs were uncertain, because she wanted to look at his face while she crossed the distance between them. She had spent 40 years reading people first in the emergency rooms of the county hospital, in the valley below then, in the mountain communities where she had driven her truck twice a week for the second 20 years of her career. Going to the people who could not come to her, she had learned to read faces the way other people read road conditions to see what was coming before it arrived. What she saw in Corvin Vickers' face was not grief. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting. She took the envelope. Inside were 2 documents. She unfolded the first one slowly, her eyes moving through the language which was legal language, the kind that is designed to be clear and dense at the same time, to say exactly what it means while making the meaning difficult to dispute. The first document described a debt. A gambling debt, it said, incurred by Ward Dunbar over a period of years secured against the property known as the Dunbar Homestead on Blackwood Ridge, Garfield County, Colorado. The amount was specific. The terms were specific. The date of the securing agreement was specific. She read the date. She read it again. Ward had been diagnosed with his heart condition in the fall of 2019. She had driven him to the cardiologist herself. She had sat in the office and listened to the doctor explain what the scans showed and what it meant. And on the way home, Ward had been quiet for a long time. And then he had said, "I am not going to let this mountain go while I am still breathing." And she had said, "You are not going to let anything go." And he had squeezed her hand. The date on the debt agreement was November of 2019. 6 weeks after the diagnosis. She kept her face neutral. This was a skill she had acquired in her first year of nursing in the emergency department, when she learned that patients read the faces of the people treating them for information that the words had not yet delivered. A face that showed what it knew too early was a face that could not be trusted with difficult situations. She unfolded the second document. It was an authorization for property transfer. An agreement, it said, signed by Ward Dunbar, transferring all rights and claims to the Dunbar homestead property to Corvin Vickers in satisfaction of the outstanding debt. She looked at the signature. Ward Dunbar. The name written out in full in a careful, forward-leaning script that filled the signature line completely. 40 years. She had watched Ward sign his name to tax documents and purchase agreements and the occasional birthday card for 20 years on this mountain. She had seen him sign his name 1,000 times. Ward Dunbar did not sign his name Ward Dunbar. He had never in his adult life signed his full name to anything. He signed W.D., 2 letters, a period, 2 letters, a period. A habit from his father, who had signed the same way, who had told him once that a man's initials were worth more than his name because they meant he had already written his name so many times, he trusted the shorthand. The signature on this document was not Ward's signature. It was a forgery made by someone who had found out his full name, but had not known how he used it. She folded both documents carefully. She put them back in the envelope. She handed the envelope back to Corvin. She said, "How long do I have?" Corvin said, "The sheriff here has the paperwork. The transfer is already recorded. The property is mine as of the date of that agreement." She said, "How long do I have to collect my things?" Corvin said, "1 hour is fair." She looked at him for a moment without speaking. She looked at Sheriff Boyd Cutler, who was studying the middle distance with the particular concentration of a man who has learned to look busy when he does not want to look involved. She had known Boyd Cutler for 15 years. She had treated his mother when his mother could not make the drive down to the valley. She had sat in Boyd Cutler's kitchen and eaten his wife's cornbread and talked about the weather and the road conditions. Boyd Cutler did not meet her eyes. She turned and went back inside. The cabin was 1,600 square feet of board and beam that she and Ward had built in the second year they lived on the mountain, replacing the original structure that had been there when they bought the land. They had done most of it themselves, which was to say that Ward had done most of it, and Cece had done the parts that required 2 people and the parts that required someone who could read a level. It had taken them 3 summers to get it right. The roof had a pitch that shed snow without letting the weight accumulate. The windows faced south and east for the morning light. The stovepipe ran straight and true and had never once given them trouble. She stood in the middle of the main room and she looked at it. She did not let herself feel it yet. There would be time for that later, or there would not. But either way, now was not the time. Now was the time for the list in her head. The list that 40 years of emergency medicine had trained her to make in any situation. where the variables were hostile and the time was limited. She had 50 minutes. She was going to use every one of them. She went to the closet first. Ward's canvas pack, large external frame, the kind designed for multi-day mountain travel, the kind that could carry 60 pounds without destroying the back of the person carrying it. She pulled it out and opened it on the bed and began. Ward's rifle, a bolt-action .30-06 that he had owned since he was 25 years old, and that he had maintained with the careful attention of a man who understood that a well-kept tool was a tool that would not fail you when you needed it most. She checked the chamber out of habit, the way she had been taught, the way she always checked. Empty. She reached into the top shelf of the closet for the ammunition. The hunting knife. Her own, not Ward's, a fixed blade she had carried in her kit for 15 years. The kind of knife that was a tool before it was anything else. The small axe. Ward's kept sharp with a hickory handle he had replaced himself 2 years ago. The cast iron pot. The one she used for everything, seasoned black, capable of being used over a fire without a grate. If she built the fire correctly. The medical kit. She had maintained it herself for 20 years of mountain nursing, restocked it twice a year. Knew its contents the way she knew the contents of her own hands. She added it to the pack without opening it. 2 wool blankets. The heavy ones, not the decorative ones on the guest room bed. The working blankets from the cedar chest at the foot of her own bed. The ones that had been used in this house for actual cold rather than for looking warm. Food. She went to the pantry with the focus of a woman who has done triage 1,000 times. Not everything. The things that would last and the things that would give the most value per pound. Dried beans, flour, salt. Matches 3 boxes. Coffee. A jar of rendered lard. Dried fruit. The jerked venison Ward had made in September that was hanging in the cold corner of the pantry in a cloth bag. She did not take photographs. This was a decision she made consciously and quickly. The way she made medical decisions by identifying what the situation required rather than what she felt. The photographs were real and they mattered. And they belonged to her in every way that an object could belong to a person. But they were also weight she could not carry and emotion she could not afford right now. She would carry them in her memory instead. Memory was the one thing Corvin Vickers could not put his name on a document and take away. She did not take the wedding quilt. She did not take her mother's dishes. She did not take the small wooden box on Ward's side of the dresser that held the things he had kept close to him. His father's watch, the arrowhead he had found on the ridge, the summer they moved up here, the photograph of the 2 of them from the first winter. She stood for one moment with her hand on that box. Then she closed the dresser drawer, shouldered the pack, and walked out. Corvin was standing near his truck. Sheriff Cutler had moved to the porch steps, not blocking them. Not blocking them, standing in the particular neutral position of a man who is present without being responsible. Cece came down the porch steps with the pack on her back and Ward's rifle in her right hand. She did not look at Corvin. She did not look at Boyd Cutler. She walked across the yard toward the tree line. Corvin said, "Cece, there is nowhere to go up there. The passes will be closed by end of month." She kept walking. He called after her. He said wolves are hungry this year. She did not turn around. She walked into the trees and she kept walking. And the cabin disappeared behind her. And the sound of the truck engine starting disappeared behind that. And then there was only the sound of the mountain, the wind in the pines and the creak of the aspens, losing their last leaves in the October cold, and the sound of her own boots on the frozen ground, and the weight of the pack, and the list in her head that was already moving to its next section. Because she was not walking away. She was walking towards something. Ward had shown her Devil's Throat in the 4th summer they lived on the mountain. He had been checking a fence line on the upper property, and she had gone with him because it was a good day, and they were in the habit of going places together when they could. He had taken her up through the timber above the timberline across a talus field that required careful walking, and along the base of a limestone formation that ran east to west across the upper face of the ridge, like a wall. He had called it Devil's Throat because of the way the entrance looked. A narrow opening in the rock face, vertical, wide enough for a person to enter sideways, but not much more the kind of gap that looked like nothing from 10 feet away, because it was half hidden behind a fold in the limestone and a growth of old juniper that had rooted in a crack in the rock. Inside, he had said the space opened. He had found it by accident 20 years before she met him, when he was still running trap lines on the upper ridge and had been caught in a 3-day storm with inadequate shelter. He had stumbled into the entrance in the dark and found himself in a dry cave, large enough to stand in, large enough to sleep in, with a natural chimney in the dome of the ceiling, where the rock had fractured along an old fault line, and the gap ran all the way to the surface. He had survived that storm because of that cave. He had never told anyone else about it. He told Cece. He told her the way he told her things that mattered not with ceremony, but with precision. The way you pass on the information a person might need someday. He showed her the entrance the way the fold in the rock hid it from below. He showed her the chimney crack in the dome, showed her how the draft worked. Cold air sinking in through the entrance, warming slightly over the stone floor, rising to the chimney. He showed her where the springs seeped through the east wall in wet years, a reliable source of water even in winter if you knew where to press your hand against the rock. He had said, "I hope you never need this, but I want you to know where it is." She had filed it away the way she filed medical information, precisely and completely, in the part of her mind reserved for things that might matter when other things were failing. That was 18 years ago. She had been walking for 4 hours when she reached the talus field. The pack weighed 52 pounds. She had estimated it before she left the cabin, running the numbers in her head, the way she had learned to estimate patient weights and medication doses, with the comfortable approximation of long practice. 52 pounds was within her range. She had carried more in her years of mountain nursing, carrying equipment to people in places where vehicles could not go. The talus was harder than it had been in summer. The stones were frost-rimed, and the gaps between them were invisible under a thin skin of early ice. She picked her way across it, slowly testing each placement, before committing her weight, using the rifle as a staff in the way Ward had taught her, the butt against the rock for stability on the steep sections. She did not hurry. Hurrying on talus was how ankles broke. A broken ankle at this altitude in October with winter coming was a death sentence. She crossed the talus in 40 minutes. The limestone formation appeared above her as she entered the upper timber, a gray wall running east to west, in the way Ward had described the rock face, bare and pale against the darker color of the mountain behind it. She followed it east, looking for the fold in the rock, looking for the juniper. She almost walked past it. The juniper had grown in the 18 years since Ward had shown her. What had been a modest shrub was now a substantial growth, and the fold in the rock behind it was less obvious than she remembered. She stopped and looked at the wall carefully. The way she had learned to look at things she was having trouble seeing, not by focusing harder, but by letting the focus soften, by looking at the whole rather than the part. There, the shadow behind the juniper was a different quality from the other shadows on the rock face. Deeper, more consistent. The particular quality of an opening that went somewhere, rather than stopping at the surface. She pushed through the juniper and stood at the entrance. The gap was narrower than she remembered, or she was larger. She turned sideways and pressed through the pack, scraping against the limestone on both sides. And then she was inside. For a moment she stood still in the dark and breathed. The air was cold, but not the cold of the outside. Not the moving cold that found the gaps in clothing and worked its way in. This was still cold, the cold of a closed place, the cold of stone that had not seen sun in years. But it was not the killing cold. It was the cold of a root cellar in late autumn, the cold of a place that could be made warmer. She found the matches in the outside pocket of the pack. The first flame showed her the dome above her head, the stone walls on 3 sides, the floor of compacted dirt and limestone grit. The space was roughly the size of the main room in the cabin she had just left, 20 feet across, 15 feet deep, with a ceiling that varied between 7 and 10 feet. At the far end, the east wall showed a dark stain of moisture that ran from a crack in the rock to the floor. She held the match up toward the ceiling. The flame pulled, just slightly, just enough to show direction. The draft from the chimney was working. She let the match go out. She stood in the dark, and she thought about the next 5 months, in the way she thought about long cases. Complex cases, the kind that required planning at multiple levels simultaneously. She thought about fire. She thought about food. She thought about water. She thought about the winter that was coming, which she knew from 40 years on this mountain would be serious, which always was serious at this altitude, which would test everything she built here before February, let alone before the passes opened in spring. She thought about Corvin Vickers. She thought about the document she had been handed. She thought about the signature that was not Ward's signature. Ward had never signed his full name in his adult life. She knew this with the complete certainty of a woman who had watched the same person write their name for 20 years in 100 different contexts. He signed W.D., the period after the W, the period after the D, the particular economy of a man who had inherited a habit from his father and kept it because it was his. The signature on that document had been made by someone who knew his name but had not known him. She thought about the date on the debt agreement, November 2019, 6 weeks after the cardiologist's office, 6 weeks after Corvin had learned from wherever he had learned it that Ward Dunbar had a heart condition, serious enough to eventually end his life on Blackwood Ridge. She thought about Sheriff Boyd Cutler studying the middle distance. She thought about how long a plan like this would take to put together, and what it would require, and what would need to be in place before a man like Corvin Vickers would feel confident enough to drive up a mountain road 4 days after a funeral with paperwork already stamped. She thought about what kind of record a man like that might keep. A man who was paying someone. A man who was paying someone over a period of years in amounts he would need to track against the day when the arrangement was finally used. A man who would want documentation, not for legal purposes but for the same reason. All such men kept documentation because the person being paid also knew things, and the record was the thing that kept the balance of knowledge even. She struck another match. She held it up and she looked at the space that was going to be her home for the next 5 months. And she began to plan, not because she had accepted what had been done to her, because she understood something that Corvin Vickers did not understand. Survival was not the opposite of justice. Survival was the prerequisite for it. She was 63 years old. She had spent 40 years keeping people alive in conditions that were trying to kill them. She had done it with inadequate equipment and inadequate sleep and inadequate time. And she had done it on the side of a mountain in the dark more than once. She was not soft. she had never been soft. Ward had known that. It was part of what he had loved about her, the particular toughness of a woman who had chosen to be useful in hard places. The mountain was hard. The mountain was also what she knew. Corvin Vickers had made his calculation based on what he understood about a 63-year-old widow alone on a mountain in October. He had not made his calculation based on what she actually was. That was his mistake, not hers. She let the second match go out. She stood in the dark in Devil's Throat, and she listened to the mountain, the deep, slow sound of rock and cold, and the movement of air through a fissure that ran from the interior of the earth all the way to the surface, sky above her head. Then she took out the third match, and she began to build. The first thing she did was fire. Not a large fire. Not yet. A small fire carefully placed directly beneath the chimney crack, built from the driest material she had. The pine needles she had collected from the floor of the talus approach, and the handful of birch bark she had stripped on the way up, knowing she would need it. The fire served two purposes. It confirmed the chimney draft was working, which it was, the smoke pulling upward in the straight column of a functional flue, rather than rolling back into the room. And it gave her light. By firelight, she assessed the space in the methodical way she had assessed medical situations for 40 years. She identified the problems in order of severity. Cold, which was manageable but would become critical without consistent heat. Water, which the seep on the east wall would provide if it held through winter. Food, which she had enough of for perhaps 6 weeks if she was careful. And the traps produced. Wood, which the mountain had in abundance but which would need to be cut and carried and stacked before the deep cold made the upper slopes inaccessible. She also assessed the assets. The chimney was the primary asset, the feature that made everything else possible. Without it, fire would poison her in a sealed space before it warmed her. With it, she could maintain heat indefinitely as long as she had fuel. The dry floor was an asset. Limestone did not hold moisture the way granite did, and the floor of the cave had the particular texture of a surface that drained rather than pooled. The entrance was an asset and a liability simultaneously. Narrow enough to be defensible and easy to block against wind. Visible enough to be found if someone was looking carefully. She would need to address the entrance. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, she ate a small meal of dried beans she had soaked in the pot with melted snow, added a piece of the jerked venison, drank water from the seep wall, and she sat with her back against the west wall of the cave, and she listened to the October wind above her on the mountain, and she thought about Ward, not about losing him, about what he had given her. 20 years of watching him work in this landscape, of following him on fence lines and timber cuts, and the long, slow surveys he did every spring to assess what the winter had done to the property. 20 years of listening to him talk about the mountain the way he had grown up talking about it, as a living system, with its own logic, its own patterns, its own language that rewarded the people who took the time to learn it, and punished the ones who didn't. He had said once, sitting on this mountain in early summer, with a view of 3 counties, that the mountain didn't care whether you survived. The mountain wasn't interested in your survival. The mountain was just the mountain. But it had a logic, and if you understood the logic, you could use it. And if you used it correctly, it would do things for you that nothing else could. She had thought she understood what he meant. She was beginning to understand it more completely. The fire settled into coals. She banked them carefully with the end of a stick, the way she had banked 100 campfires in 20 years of mountain life, conserving the heat rather than letting it burn away, maintaining the core that would allow her to rebuild in the morning with minimal material. Then she wrapped herself in both wool blankets settled into the corner where the wall and the floor met at the most protected angle, and she closed her eyes. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark, and she thought about the signature on the document. Ward Dunbar, written in full. The careful, looping letters of a person who had practiced writing a name that was not theirs. She thought about what Corvin Vickers was doing right now in the cabin she and Ward had built with their own hands. She thought about what he was expecting to happen to her. Then she let those thoughts go. Not because they were not important, because they were not urgent. Urgency was tonight. Tonight was warmth and rest and the calculation of what the next day required. The wind moved across the ridge above her. Somewhere in the darkness, something small moved through the brush near the entrance, a sound she identified without opening her eyes as the particular sound of a snowshoe, ere the quiet scrape of its feet on the frost-hardened ground. She filed that information away. She would need to set traps before the week was out. She would need to know every game trail within a mile of this location. She would need to know this part of the mountain the way she knew the emergency department she had worked in for 20 years, where everything was what everything did, which paths led, where. She had the winter to learn it. The fire was warm. The chimney was working. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the dark pines of Blackwood Ridge and carried the smell of coming snow, and the particular cold that meant the season had made its decision and was not going to reconsider. Cecilia Dunbar closed her eyes and let the mountain do what it had always done, which was to go on being the mountain, indifferent and enormous and full of the kind of logic that rewarded the people who took the time to understand it. She was going to take the time. She had all winter. She worked before the light was fully up. This had been her habit for 40 years. The habit of a woman who had learned early that the hours before the world made its demands were the hours that belonged entirely to the person who was awake enough to claim them. In the emergency department, she had used those early hours to review cases, to think through the decisions of the previous shift, to prepare herself for the day's particular uncertainties. On the mountain with Ward, she had used them to walk the property, to check the animals, to stand at the edge of the ridge and watch the valley below come gradually into color as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. Here in Devil's Throat, she used them to build. The axe work started on the third day when she had established enough of a routine inside the cave to begin thinking about the weeks ahead rather than just the hours. The dead timber on the north-facing slope below the timberline was what she needed, the standing dead ponderosa and lodgepole that had been killed by beetle kill over the past decade, wood that was dry all the way through because it had been dead long enough, wood that would burn hot and steady without the hissing and spitting of green wood that wasted heat as steam. She felled the trees with Ward's axe. The small one, not a felling axe, but adequate for the diameter of what she was taking. She kept the cuts low and angled the way Ward had taught her so the stump shed water rather than collected it, and the wood around it stayed sound. She worked in a pattern that moved her further from the cave each day and then brought her back to it, carrying load after load up the slope in the canvas pack, her shoulders burning by noon and beyond, caring by mid-afternoon. She counted each load. This was the nurse in her. Quantify what you have. Know what you need. Work toward the number rather than working until you are too tired to work. The number she had calculated was 180 loads, which was an approximation based on the burn rate of a small fire maintained 16 hours a day for 150 days, with a margin for the deep, cold weeks when the fire would need to run hotter. It was a number that made her chest tight when she first arrived at it, and then became a target, something to move towards, something that converted despair into arithmetic. By the end of the first week, she had 32 loads stacked in the interior of the cave, piled along the west wall. in the careful, alternating pattern that maximized the stack's stability and the air circulation within it. 32 out of 180. She kept working. The traps came next. She set them on the second day before the axe work started, because she understood from experience that traps required time to become part of the landscape, that animals noticed the disturbance of a new trap and avoided it for the first several days, until the human smell faded and the surrounding environment closed around the intrusion and made it ordinary. The sooner she set them, the sooner the traps would begin producing. She set 20 traps on the first round using the deadfall design Ward had shown her on a camping trip years before, the simple 3-stick mechanism that required nothing but the right stones and the right placement. She set them along the game trails she found by walking the slope in the early mornings, when the frost preserved the tracks, the fine-printed trails of hares, and the heavier impressions of grouse, the occasional larger track that told her about the deer that were moving through the lower timber. As winter pushed them down from the high country, she checked the traps every dawn with hands that were stiff from the cold and fingers that had to be warmed inside her coat before they could work the mechanisms. The first hare came on the 4th day. She skinned it outside the cave, working quickly in the cold air, her hands moving through the process with the particular efficiency of someone who has done a thing enough times that the body does it while the mind is somewhere else. The smell of blood and fresh meat in the cold mountain air was sharp and vivid, and she did not look away from it. She was not the kind of person who looked away from things. She built the smoking rack from saplings lashed to a frame of stones beneath the chimney crack, a design she arrived at by considering the problem with the same approach she used for improvised medical solutions. What is available? What does the problem require? What is the simplest arrangement that meets both conditions? Green hickory was best for smoking, which Ward had told her something about the particular compounds in the wood that preserved and flavored simultaneously. She found it on the lower slope. Cut thin strips of branch fed them into the coals below the rack. The smoke rose through the chimney crack and carried the smell of the cave away from anything that might follow it, and the meat cured slowly in the cold, dry air above the fire. She gathered what the mountain offered: pine nuts from the caches that squirrels had made and then in 2 cases abandoned, perhaps, because the squirrel had not survived the early frosts, perhaps because it had simply miscounted. She collected them without guilt. The mountain did not distribute its resources according to who had the original claim. It distributed them according to who found them and could use them. Cattail roots from the frozen margins of the small pond below the talus field, dug with the knife rinsed in the icy water carried back in the pot. They were starchy and dense and not particularly pleasant, but they were calories, and in the economy of winter, survival calories were the currency that everything else was priced in. Rose hips from the scattered wild rose that grew along the rocky outcroppings on the south-facing slopes, their fruit drying to a deep orange red. As the season progressed, tough-skinned and sour, but rich with the vitamin C that would stand between her and scurvy in the months when no fresh food was available. She worked until the light failed each evening, and then she worked by firelight until her eyes could no longer focus reliably. And then she banked the fire and slept. She had been living in Devil's Throat for 3 weeks when she came back from the lower ridge one afternoon and found the entrance uncovered. She stopped 15 feet from the cave. She stood still and she looked. The juniper branches she had woven across the entrance as a screen, the layered covering of brush and pine bough that she had built over the first week to make the gap in the rock face look like the rock face had been pulled shitaya, not blown aside. The branches were not scattered randomly the way wind would have left them. They were pulled to one side in a way that had direction in it. the kind of direction that hands make when they are moving something out of the way. She brought the rifle up. She held it and she listened, and she looked at the ground. Boot prints. Large, heavy, the deep impression of a man's boot with a lug sole, the kind worn for serious outdoor work. 2 sets coming in, 2 sets going out. She tracked them with her eyes from the entrance back down the slope, and then turned to follow them up toward the north, toward the higher ridge. Recent. The frost around the edges of the prints was still sharp, rather than crumbled, which meant they had been made within the last few hours. She lowered the rifle. She pushed through the remnants of the brush screen and stood in the entrance and looked. The smoking rack was on its side. The meat that had been curing on it, 9 days of accumulated hare and squirrel and 2 grouse from the traps, was on the floor of the cave ground, into the dirt under the weight of a boot that had stepped on it deliberately. The flour was open. Half of it had been poured across the stone floor in a pale, spreading fan that could not be recovered. 2 of her carefully stacked fuel loads had been taken, the outermost ones, the logs that were thickest and driest, the best of what she had cut. Pinned to a log with her own knife was a piece of paper. She crossed the cave and took the knife out of the wood, and she looked at the paper. The handwriting was Corvin Vickers. She had seen it on enough notes over enough years to recognize it. The particular cramped backward slant of a man who had taught himself to write and had never been corrected. The note said one thing. It said, "Winter is long up here." She stood in the wrecked interior of her cave, and she read those 4 words, and she held them for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor, not because her legs had failed, because she had learned in 40 years of difficult work that there were moments when sitting down was not surrender but something else, the deliberate creation of a stillness in which the necessary next step could reveal itself. She had sat down on emergency room floors during long shifts when a patient had died, despite everything, when the failure was complete and real, and had to be absorbed before anything useful could happen again. She had learned that the absorption was faster when she let it be what it was, rather than trying to move past it before it was finished. She sat on the floor of her cave with the wrecked evidence of 3 weeks of work around her, and she let herself feel what she felt. It was not despair. She was not built for despair in the way some people are, the way some people move toward it when the conditions are right, almost as though they expected it and had left a place for it. She had always moved toward anger instead. The particular hot, clean anger that had carried her through difficult shifts and complicated diagnoses, and the moments in her career when something was being done wrong, and she was the person who could see it and correct it. The anger came now. It came up through her chest and into her throat, and she let it come. She gave herself 10 minutes. She had learned this in the emergency department, the 10-minute rule she had never said out loud to anyone, but had practiced for years. A bad outcome got 10 minutes, not more. 10 minutes of sitting with it, feeling it completely, not managing it or diminishing it or explaining it away. And then the 10 minutes ended, and you stood up and you went back to work because there was always more work. The 10th minute ended. She stood up. She looked at the destroyed meat on the floor. She picked up the knife. She assessed the situation with the clinical thoroughness that was her fundamental nature. The food loss was serious. The flour loss was significant. The fuel loss was manageable. The greatest damage was not material. It was informational. Corvin knew where she was. He had known she was here, had found her, had done what he did, and had walked out again with the confidence of a man who believed the mountain was doing the work for him. He had not harmed her directly. He had let winter be the weapon. He had come here not to confront her, but to chip away at her margin to reduce what she had, and leave her with less than she needed to tip the balance from survival toward failure by one specific calculated degree. It told her something about him. It told her he was not reckless. He had not come to remove her from the mountain. He had come to adjust the conditions so that the mountain would do it. That was the action of a man who understood liability, who understood the difference between causing a harm and allowing a harm to occur. He had not touched her. He had only taken wood and spoiled food. He expected the winter to take care of the rest. What this meant for her was specific and required a response that was also specific. She could not stay where he could find her. She spent 2 days moving deeper into the cave system. Devil's Throat, she discovered in those 2 days of exploration with a candle stub held carefully in her cupped hands, was not a single chamber. The main room where she had been living was the forward section, accessible from the entrance, relatively well ventilated. At the back of the main room, behind a natural column of limestone that had grown from floor to ceiling over centuries, there was a narrowing passage, and through the narrowing passage there was a second room, smaller, lower ceilinged, darker, but dry. And at the top of the second room, in a corner where 2 rock faces met at an angle, there was another crack in the ceiling, smaller than the main chimney, but present a thread of moving air that told her a fire built in this room would also have somewhere to go. She moved everything, every log, every piece of dried meat that could be salvaged from the floor, the pieces that had not been crushed and had only been scattered, which was perhaps a third of what she had accumulated. Every tool, every blanket, every scrap of food. She carried it through the narrowing passage, load by load, and she stacked it in the new room, and she assessed the new room, and she rebuilt her smoking rack, and she continued. Then she sealed the passage. She spent a full day doing this, gathering the heavy flat stones from the floor of the main cave and fitting them into the passage opening, not mortar, but stone against stone. The dry stack method that old mountain builders had used for centuries. She worked them into the opening from the inside, fitting each piece against the next, filling the gaps with smaller stones, and then she stepped back and looked at her work. From the main cave, the passage now appeared to be a natural collapse. A section of wall that had fallen inward, a pile of rubble that blocked what might once have been a continuation of the space. If Corvin came back with a light, he would see the main cave empty and apparently abandoned, and a blocked passage that looked like something the mountain had done on its own. She lived in the second room like a ghost. She went out only in the dark. She had always disliked this, the loss of the light, but she adapted quickly because the alternative was losing more of her supplies to a man who was treating her survival as a logistical problem. She checked her traps in the hour before dawn, moving by the particular half-dark that preceded the sunrise on clear nights when the snow on the ground reflected the starlight and made the mountain luminous. She cut wood higher on the ridge where the beetle-killed timber was denser and where Corvin was less likely to go because the slope was steeper and the footing was treacherous. She set new traps above the cliff faces in the narrow corridors between the rock outcroppings where the hares moved through when the lower slopes became too exposed. November stripped the mountain to its bones. The aspens were long bare. The high grasses had gone to nothing. The sky had the particular quality of late autumn in the Rockies, a clarity that was also a warning, the air so dry and cold that it carried sounds farther than normal, and the sun so low and pale that it gave light without warmth, a presence without effect. She felt the pressure change on the 28th of November. She had been outside the upper entrance of the cave system, the small hatch she had made by removing a section of the stone seal from inside, checking the sky the way Ward had taught her to check it. Not just looking at it, but reading it, the particular quality of the cloud formation on the northwest horizon. the way the wind had dropped in the last hour to a stillness that was not peaceful, but expectant. The sky to the northwest was a color she had not seen before in 20 years on this mountain. Not gray, not the blue-gray of ordinary incoming weather. Purple. A deep, bruised purple that ran from the horizon upward and was overtaking the pale blue of the rest of the sky with the deliberate speed of something that had decided. Ward had described this once. He had said there is a color the sky turns before the real ones. You will know it when you see it, because it looks wrong. Too dark, too still, too quiet. Everything goes quiet first. Everything had gone quiet. She went back inside, and she pulled the last of the wood she had cut into the interior through the hatch, and she sealed the hatch from inside with the flat stone she kept beside it, and she checked the fire, and she checked her supplies, and she sat down, and she waited. The storm arrived 6 hours later. It did not arrive gently. She heard it before she felt it. A sound that began as something distant and became something enormous without any of the intermediate gradations that ordinary storms move through. The wind hit the ridge above her with a force that transmitted itself through the rock. A vibration she felt in her feet through the cave floor. A sound that was simultaneously the sound of air moving and of something solid being tested. Then the world above her disappeared. She could not know this precisely. She was inside the mountain, but she felt it in the quality of the silence that replaced the sound after the first hours of the storm's arrival, when the initial violence had settled into something sustained and permanent. The silence was the silence of burial, the silence of a surface that had been covered. 5 days. That was how long the storm lasted in its full intensity, though she could not count the days precisely, because the darkness inside the back chamber of Devil's Throat was the same darkness at noon as at midnight, and she slept in pieces rather than stretches, waking to feed the fire, sleeping again, waking to eat, sleeping again, her sense of time dissolving into the rhythm of the fire, rather than the rhythm of the sun. She managed it. She managed it because managing it was the only option available, and she was constitutionally unable to accept a situation she could not manage. She fed the fire from the wood she had stacked, measuring what she burned against what remained, keeping the math current in her head. She ate carefully. The dried meat and the pine nuts and the root meal she had prepared from the cattail roots ground with a flat stone against the cave floor, into a paste that cooked into something resembling a dense flat bread over the fire. She talked. She had not planned to do this. It had happened on the second day of the storm, when the silence of the sealed cave had become a presence in itself, a weight that she recognized from her nursing experience as the particular weight of sensory deprivation, the condition that preceded the mental deterioration that isolated patients experienced in extended intensive care. She had seen patients in windowless ICU rooms lose track of themselves over 72 hours. She had always understood it academically. She understood it now in her body. She began to speak. She spoke about Ward first, not about losing him, but about knowing him. She described the specific way he moved through the woods, the quality of his attention to the ground under his feet, the way he could tell from a track, not just what animal had made it, but how long ago, and what the animal had been doing, and which direction it was going next. She described the sound of his voice in the morning before coffee, the way he said her name when he was waking up, not Cece, but the full Cecilia, 3 syllables, each one given its weight. She spoke about her patients. She spoke about the ones she had saved and about the ones she had not been able to save. And she spoke about the difference between those two categories and what the difference had taught her. She spoke about the woman on Blackwood Ridge who had been in cardiac arrest when Cece arrived at her door, whose daughter had been doing compressions since the telephone call, and how they had worked together, Cece and the daughter, for 37 minutes, until the air ambulance landed in the field behind the house. The woman had lived. She had come to Cece's house 2 Christmases later with a pie. She spoke for hours. She spoke until her throat was dry, and then she drank water, and she spoke again. She spoke because speaking was the evidence that she was still present, still coherent, still the person she needed to be. Then, the danger came from inside. She woke one morning, she could not say what morning, and the waking was wrong. Her first awareness was of the weight of her own limbs, which were heavier than they should have been, heavy in the particular way of exhaustion, so profound it felt like illness. Her second awareness was of her head, a pain behind her eyes that was dull and consistent, and located precisely not the sharp pain of dehydration or the diffuse pain of prolonged cold, but something specific, something she recognized. Her third awareness was the fire. She opened her eyes. The fire was burning wrong. She had been a nurse in places where gases were a hazard for long enough to know the color of a fire that was burning in compromised air. A normal firewood and oxygen burned with the colors of the fuel, and the air working together, yellow and orange and white at the core, the colors of a complete reaction. The fire in front of her was burning blue, not the entire fire. The edges of it, the outer reach of the flames where the reaction was happening at the margins of the available oxygen, blue-tinged and lower than normal, the particular visible signature of a fire that was consuming the last of what it had to consume. She understood immediately. She had worked in a carbon monoxide case once early in her career, a family in a house with a block chimney. She had walked into that house and known within 30 seconds what she was dealing with. Not from the symptoms of the family who were all incapacitated in various degrees, but from the color of the gas fireplace in the living room and the particular heaviness of the air. The blizzard had packed the chimney crack above her with snow. There was no longer anywhere for the products of combustion to go. The carbon monoxide was building in the sealed chamber. The heaviness of her limbs, the pain behind her eyes, the fact that waking had felt wrong. These were the early symptoms. She knew the progression precisely. The early symptoms became pronounced symptoms. The pronounced symptoms became impairment. The impairment became the stage where a person could no longer make correct decisions and began making incorrect ones, including the incorrect decision to lie back down because they were tired and the fire was warm, and there was a feeling of comfort that was not comfort at all, but the beginning of the body shutting down. She tried to sit up. Her arms shook with the effort. She rolled to her side and pressed her palm against the cold cave floor and pushed. The room tilted. The fire blurred. She saw Ward. He was sitting on the log pile against the wall. He was wearing the red flannel shirt he had worn every winter for 15 years. The one with the frayed collar that she had offered to replace, and he had refused because the fraying didn't bother him, and he saw no reason to change something that still worked. His face looked the way it looked when he was thinking slightly inward, not absent, but present in a different direction. He said, "Rest. It's all right. You're warm." The voice was Ward's voice exactly. The particular quality of it, the warmth and the unhurried certainty. She felt something in her chest move toward it. The way you move toward warmth when you are cold instinctively, without choice. She looked at him. She looked at his face. And the part of her that was a nurse, the part that had been a nurse for 40 years and had learned to function in the specific compressed way of a person who must be reliable in conditions designed to prevent reliability. That part said no. It said, That is not Ward. It said, Ward is dead, and that is not Ward. And you know what that is. She knew what it was. The hallucination was the symptom. The symptom was the poison. The poison was in the air she was breathing. She did not look at Ward again. She found the axe. She found it by feel her hand moving along the cave floor in the direction she knew. It was because she had placed it there herself. And she always put it in the same place, the habit of a woman who had learned that things needed to be findable in the dark. Her fingers found the hickory handle. She got to her knees. The motion was wrong. Her inner ear was not giving her reliable information, and the floor seemed to shift as she moved over it. She used the axe handle as a staff, and she moved toward the ceiling of the cave in the direction of the chimney crack, which she knew by position rather than by sight, because the fire was barely illuminating the immediate area, and the crack was in the corner above the angled wall. The axe was heavy. It was always heavy. She had swung it thousands of times over the past weeks, and it was always the same weight, and her body had learned to manage that weight with the efficiency of long practice. But her arms were not reliable. The first swing was too short, and the blade struck the lower edge of the crack without breaking through the blockage above it. She swung again. The second blow was better more from will than from strength. The particular force that comes from the understanding that the next thing you do is the last thing you will do if it does not work. The blade found the blockage. She felt it connect with the packed ice and snow above the crack. Nothing moved. The vision of Ward was still in her peripheral sight. She was not looking at it directly. She swung a third time with everything she had left, which was not much, which was the last of what the previous hours of wrong air had left available to her. And she put it all into the blow, and the blade went through. Snow and ice fell. The fire went out. The cold that came through the crack was extraordinary, not gradual, immediate. The particular cold of a mountain that had been sealed above a fire for 5 days and was now opening into a space where the air temperature was 40 degrees warmer than what was pushing in. She felt it on her face and hands like something physical. She fell backward. She lay on the cave floor in the complete darkness. The fire out, the only sound the rush of cold air through the opened crack, and the distant, indeterminate sounds of the storm still moving above her. She breathed. She breathed carefully, deliberately, pulling the cold air into her lungs in the way she had learned to breathe in difficult situations slowly and fully. The kind of breathing that moved the blood, rather than just the chest. She counted breaths the way she counted heartbeats in the field, using the rhythm to anchor herself to the present, rather than the failing present that the gas had been building. 10 breaths, 20. The weight in her limbs was still there, but it was different now. The weight of exhaustion, rather than the weight of poison. The weight of a body that had been doing something very hard for a very long time, and was now being asked to continue. She found the matches. In the darkness by feel, she found the match tin in the small pack that she kept within arm's reach of her sleeping position, because she had been a nurse for 40 years, and the preparation of the nurse was to keep what mattered close. The first match failed. Her hands were shaking in the cold air and the match head scraped wrong. The second match caught. She held it carefully, shielding it, and found the tinder bundle she kept beside the fire ring, the dry moss and pine needles and birch bark strips that she prepared fresh every 2 or 3 days, keeping them always ready, because fire was the margin between alive and not alive. and she treated the materials of fire with the same care she had given to the medications in her nursing kit. The tinder caught. The small flame grew. She fed it from the wood she had stacked beside the fire ring, and she watched it grow in the way she had watched a patient's color return after a crisis with the particular quality of attention that is not quite relief, because relief requires certainty, and certainty is never completely available. But that is closer to relief than anything else. The fire grew. She sat beside it with her blankets around her shoulders, and she breathed the cold, clean air that was coming through the chimney crack, and she waited for the trembling in her hands to slow. Ward was not in the room. He had not been in the room. She knew this. She had always known it. But she allowed herself in the quiet after the crisis had passed to speak to him anyway, to say what she would have said if he had been there. She said, "Not yet." She said it quietly to the cave wall, to the fire, to the mountain above her that had been trying to teach her something for weeks, and that she was finally beginning to understand completely. Not what Corvin Vickers thought, not what the cold thought, not what the sealed air of a block chimney thought. Cecilia Dunbar was not ready. She had things left to do that required her to be alive and present and standing upright with a lockbox in her hands and a room full of people watching her. She had 40 years of making herself useful in conditions that argued against usefulness, and she had not run out of conditions yet. December stripped her thin. The meat was gone by the middle of the month. The beans were gone. She lived on pine nuts and the root meal and the occasional hair from the traps, which produced less reliably now that the deep snow had changed the animals' movement patterns and sent some of them into longer dormancy. Her face hollowed. Her hands lost their padding, the flesh over the knuckles thinning until the joints were prominent, and the tendons moved visibly under the skin when she flexed her fingers. She did not weigh herself. There was no way to weigh herself. But she could feel the change in the way the blankets lay on her shoulders, in the way the pack sat on her hips, in the effort required to carry a load that had been manageable in October. She kept working. Every morning she pulled the hatch open before dawn and climbed out into the pre-dawn dark. And she checked the traps, and she noted what the mountain was doing. And she returned to the cave with whatever the traps had given her, or had not given her. And she made what she had into what she needed. She talked to Ward some evenings, not because she believed he was there, because the sound of her own voice organizing itself into conversation kept her from the particular drift that she recognized as the early stage of the mental degradation that isolation produced. She had seen it in patients. She recognized its approach in herself. She resisted it by talking. She told Ward about the work she had done, about the specific problem of the chimney blockage and how she had solved it, and what she had added to her morning routine. Since then, the habit of checking the crack in the ceiling every morning and evening, with a candle held near it to test the draft, so that she would know before the symptoms presented rather than after. She told him about Corvin. She told him what she had understood about Corvin's plan. Not just the plan to take the property, but the longer plan, the one that began in November of 2019 when he had learned about the heart diagnosis and had started making arrangements, building the financial and legal structure that would be in place when the time came. She had thought about this in the long, dark hours of the sealed cave, and what she had arrived at was a picture of patience and deliberateness that she found in a way she had not expected clarifying rather than frightening. It clarified because it told her that the same records that required a man like Corvin to have would be kept somewhere. He would not carry them in his head. He would keep them the way a man kept things he needed to prove, and also things he needed to hold over the person he had paid. Paper was the language of arrangements like the one Corvin had made with Boyd Cutler. Paper was the proof and the threat simultaneously. She told Ward about the signature. She told him about the way the forger had written Ward Dunbar in full. The careful, looping script of a person who had copied a name without understanding how the person who owned that name used it. She told him she was going to need that paper when the spring came. She told him she had a plan. January took the last of the food. She lived on boiled bark, and what the traps gave her, which, in the worst week of January, was nothing for 5 straight days. She was genuinely hungry in a way she had not been hungry since childhood. The kind of hunger that became a physical fact, rather than a feeling. A presence in the body that occupied attention. The way pain occupied attention steadily and without mercy. She did not stop working. Every morning she left the cave, and she checked the traps, and she cut what wood she could. And she moved on the mountain in the way Ward had moved on it, with attention rather than speed. Reading the surface of the snow for what it had to tell her about what had moved through in the night. What was coming through tomorrow. What the mountain was doing and where its resources were. She found the deer on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of January, a young doe that had come down from the high country ahead of a cold front, and had made the mistake of taking shelter under an overhang that was also where the mountain lion came to rest. She had not seen the lion. She had seen the evidence of it, the tracks in the snow, and the particular disruption of the surface that told a clear story about what had happened, and how long ago. The lion had eaten its fill and left. What it had left was enough. She spent the rest of that day in the cold, processing the carcass, her hands moving through the work with the efficient thoroughness of long experience, taking everything the deer had to offer. The meat and the fat and the hide and the sinew, all of it. Nothing wasted, everything with a purpose. She carried it back to the cave in 3 trips. She rebuilt the smoking rack. She went back to work. February was still. The storms had passed through and the mountain had settled into the cold blue stillness of deep winter. The kind of cold that was complete and permanent rather than violent. The cold of a season that had made its point and was holding it. She was thinner than she had ever been. But she was clear. She was clear in the way that people become clear when everything unnecessary has been removed from the immediate situation. When what remains is the essential. When there is nothing left to manage except what matters. She was clear about Corvin Vickers and what he had done. She was clear about Boyd Cutler and what he had been paid to do. She was clear about the signature and the debt document and what those documents would mean to a judge who was shown alongside them a collection of records kept by a man who had been paying the sheriff of Garfield County for 4 years. She was clear about where those records would be, not in the cabin. She had thought about this for weeks, and she had arrived at the same answer each time. Corvin was not a careless man. He was a man who kept records, and also kept the records separate from the thing the records could be used to undo. He would not keep the payment ledger in the cabin he had taken from her because, if she came back for the cabin, the ledger would come with it. He would keep it somewhere else, somewhere that was his, and only his, and that she would not think to look. The hunting camp on the North Ridge. Corvin had maintained a hunting camp on the North Ridge of the property for 15 years. Ward had mentioned it once as the kind of thing a man like Corvin would maintain, a structure that was his alone, that no woman he was married to would have reason to access. A place where things could be kept that didn't need to be explained. She would go there in spring. She would go there because spring was coming. She could feel it in the mountain the way you feel a change in a patient. Before the numbers change, a quality in the air, a shift in the pressure, the particular lightness that preceded a thaw. It was not warm. It was not close. but it was coming. Cecilia Dunbar lay in the back chamber of Devil's Throat in February on a mountain in Colorado, and she felt the season turning above her. And she made her plans, and she waited for the right moment to descend. She was not finished. She was 63 years old, and she had survived a winter that was trying to kill her. And she was not finished. There was work left to do. The thaw came the way Ward had always said. It came on the high ridge not all at once, but in increments so small you could miss them if you were watching for the dramatic rather than the precise. She felt it first in the air pressure. She had been monitoring it the way a ship's captain monitors a barometer, not with instruments, but with the accumulated sensitivity of 20 years of living at altitude, where pressure changes were the most reliable advance notice of what the sky intended to do. The pressure in February had been the pressure of deep winter. Stable and settled, the kind that held conditions fixed for days at a time. In the first week of March, something in that stability changed, not dramatically. A loosening, a quality in the air that was less held, less certain of itself. She lay in the back chamber of Devil's Throat and she noted it. Then she noted it again the next day, more pronounced. On the 5th of March, she climbed out through the hatch in the pre-dawn dark, and she stood on the surface of the mountain for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, having gone out only briefly in the deepest cold to check the traps and retrieve what they gave her, and return. She stood on the crusted snow in the darkness, and she breathed the air, and she looked at the sky to the south. The stars over the southern peaks had a quality she recognized, not the sharp blue-white of deep winter stars, which had a brittleness to them, a quality of light through extremely cold and extremely dry air. These stars were slightly softer at their edges, the difference small, but present the difference between glass and water. The air above the southern peaks was holding a fraction more moisture than it had been holding a week ago. She stood in the dark and she breathed, and she thought about Ward. She thought about the way he had stood at the edge of their property in early March of every year they had been on this mountain and looked at the sky in the particular way he looked at things he was trying to read, not just seeing but asking a question and waiting for the answer. She had stood beside him dozens of times and watched him do it, and she had learned over the years to ask the same question with her own looking. The question was simple. Is it time? She looked at the sky for a long time. Then she went back inside and she began to prepare. Preparation took 3 days. Not because there was much to prepare, there was very little left of what she had come to the cave with, and very little she had accumulated since. But because preparation in this context was not about accumulating but about assessing. She took inventory of what she had. She assessed her own condition honestly the way she had assessed patients for the entirety of her nursing career, without sentiment and without self-deception. She was thinner than she had ever been. The mirror was irrelevant because she had no mirror, but she knew her own body's weight by how it moved, how it responded to effort, how the pack sat on her hips when she loaded it. She had lost somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds, which on a woman of her height and original build left her functional, but diminished a tool that had been used hard and maintained minimally, and needed rest and food, and the restoration that only ending the immediate crisis could provide. Her hands were not soft. They had not been soft for 40 years of nursing, but they were a different kind of hard. Now the particular hard of hands that had been doing outdoor work in extreme cold for 5 months. A hardness that ran deeper than skin into the tendons and the joints. They worked. They were reliable. They were not what they had been. Her mind was clear. This was the assessment that mattered most. She had been watching it for 5 months. The way she watched the fire. checking its condition against a baseline, noting any deviation. She had been clear in February, and she was clear now. The hallucination of Ward in the carbon monoxide crisis had been a symptom, not a failure. She had recognized it for what it was while it was happening. That recognition was the proof the clarity was intact. She had been talking to Ward in the evenings, and she was honest with herself about what that was. Not grief made pathological. Not a woman who had lost her grip on reality. A woman who understood the difference between talking to herself and believing she was being heard, and who had made a deliberate choice to use the form of conversation. Because conversation was the cognitive tool she needed in that context. She was clear. She loaded the pack. Ward's rifle, the ammunition that remained, which was more than she had expected when she counted it. The combination of careful shooting and the fact that she had not needed to shoot much. The traps having been her primary source of meat. The knife, the axe. The medical kit, diminished but present. The remaining food, which was 4 days' worth if she ate carefully. And the mountain did not offer anything additional on the way down. She left the blankets. She left the smoking rack and the stone structure of the fire ring and the stacked remnants of the wood she had cut and the careful system she had built to manage the chimney draft. She left them because she was not coming back, and because they were the kind of thing the mountain could have. The kind of thing that might someday be useful to someone else who found this place and needed it. She put the hatch stones aside and she climbed out into the morning. March on the high ridge of Blackwood was not warm. The snow was 3 and 4 feet deep in the open areas and deeper in the drifts behind the outcroppings and the surface crust that had formed during the cold, clear days of late February, supported her weight in places and did not in others, which made the walking unpredictable and slow. She had made crude snowshoes from branches, and the rawhide she had cut from the deer hide in January, and they helped enough to make the difference between passable and impassable on the open slopes. She went to Ward's grave first. It was not on the way down. It was on the way to the cabin, which was slightly east of the direct descent, and she added the time without deliberation, because it was the only thing she needed to do before anything else. She had been thinking about it for months. Not obsessively, but consistently, the way a person thinks about something they intend to do when the time is right. The time was right. The grave was beneath 3 feet of snow. The marker invisible, but she knew exactly where it was. The way she knew the location of anything she had placed with intention and attention. She brushed the snow away from the marker with her forearm, the piece of granite she had carried from the creek bed, and set against the base of the ponderosa at the edge of the tree line, the one with the natural crease in its face that she had carved his initials into with the knife. W.D. His initials, not his full name. The shorthand that had been his signature for 40 years, and that some forger had not known about. She stood at the grave for a while. She did not speak at length. She had said everything she needed to say to him in the cave over the winter. The long evenings of speaking out loud into the dark. The accumulation of a conversation that had been ongoing since October. What remained was not unsaid, but unsent the particular transaction of presence that required being at the right location. She said, "I found what you left me." She meant the cave. She meant the knowledge he had spent 20 years giving her about this mountain and its systems and its logic. She meant the quality of attention he had modeled for her so consistently and for so long, that she had absorbed it into her own way of seeing without realizing how thoroughly it had become hers. She said, "I am going to finish it now." She put her hand briefly on the cold granite of the marker, and then she adjusted the pack on her shoulders, and she turned east. The hunting camp was on the north ridge, 2 miles from the grave marker, at an elevation slightly above the cabin, accessible from the main property by a track that Ward had never used, but that Cece had seen on the property survey 20 years ago. She knew its general location. She knew it from the kind of oblique knowledge that comes from living near a thing for a long time, without ever going to it the way you know where your neighbors keep their garbage cans from years of noticing without looking. The north ridge was exposed. The wind came off the high country to the northwest and ran down the ridge face without obstruction, and the snow conditions on the exposed slope were different from the sheltered areas she had been moving through. Wind-scoured and dense in some sections, deeply drifted in others where the rock outcroppings created eddies in the airflow. She picked her way across it with the care the conditions required, testing the surface, reading the snow the way Ward had taught her to read it. She smelled the camp before she saw the damage. Not smoke, not fire. The particular smell of disturbed pine. The sharp resin smell that released when a large tree broke, when the wood itself was exposed to the air after being sealed in bark for decades. She knew that smell. She had grown up in these mountains, and she had smelled it after every significant wind event and every avalanche. She came around the shoulder of the ridge, and she stopped. The north-facing slope above the camp had released. She had known it might. She had been thinking about it since December, when the storm had loaded the slope, and she had understood, doing the mental calculations she had learned from Ward, that the accumulation above the camp was approaching the threshold where a sufficient disturbance would send it down. She had not known when. She had not known if. She had only known that the conditions were present. The avalanche had not been small. The entire upper face of the north slope had come down a section, perhaps 300 feet wide and 200 feet long, and it had come down through the camp, and beyond it, carrying the trees at the camp's edge with it, and depositing them in the valley below, in the particular chaos of a debris field where size and weight and velocity had conspired to produce something that looked less like a natural event and more like an argument. The tent structure was gone. The canvas had been torn and was visible in fragments among the debris, the poles bent and half buried. The fuel containers that had been stored at the camp's edge were scattered down the slope. The large, flat stones that had formed the fire ring were overturned and displaced. Cece stood at the edge of the debris field, and she looked at it, looked. She was a nurse. She had responded to accidents and emergencies for 40 years, including 2 avalanche rescues in her years as a mountain nurse, and the professional part of her mind that could not be turned off, the part that assessed every scene for life signs and actionable priorities, was already reading the debris field before the rest of her had decided what to do. She went down into it. She moved carefully through the debris, testing her footing with each step. The surface of the slide path unstable in the way of all avalanche deposits. The snow compacted and irregular and concealing voids that the surface gave no indication of. She worked from the outside inward, the way you worked any collapse systematically, and from the periphery toward the most likely location of what you were looking for. She found Corvin Vickers 20 minutes later. He was in the eastern margin of the debris, partially exposed where the slide had thinned, before stopping enough of him above the surface that she was able to assess him without excavation. The cold had preserved him in the way of extreme cold, and she was clinical about what she saw, because 40 years had made her clinical, and because being clinical was how she honored the fact of death, rather than turning away from it. She stood over him, and she was quiet for a moment, not for grief. She did not have grief for Corvin Vickers in the way she had grief for other deaths she had witnessed. What she felt was quieter and more complex than grief, a kind of stillness that she associated with outcomes that were complete, without being satisfying the end of a process that had needed to end. She thought about what Ward had said about the mountain. The mountain did not care whether you survived. It was not interested in you. It had a logic, and the logic applied to everyone equally. And the people who respected the logic were not rewarded. And the people who ignored the logic were not punished. They were simply subject to it. The consequences of ignoring it were not punishment. They were physics. Corvin Vickers had made his camp in a location below an overloaded slope. The slope had done what overloaded slopes do. Cece looked at the eastern margin of the debris field, and she began to look for what she had come to find. She found it beneath his left arm. He had been holding it. She understood when the slide came. Holding it or reaching for it, carrying it toward the camp entrance, or away from it. The particular position of the arm and the shoulder suggested the instinctive cradling of something being protected. The unconscious priority a person assigned to the thing they were carrying when everything went wrong at once. A metal box. She recognized the type. It was the kind sold in hardware stores for documents and valuables. The kind with a simple key lock. Gray-painted steel approximately the size of a hardcover book. It was cold in her hands and slightly dented on one corner where something in the slide had struck it. The lock was intact. She did not have the key. She had not expected to have the key. She sat down on a timber from the debris field, and she considered this for a moment. And then she took out the hunting knife, and she applied it to the lock mechanism, in the way she had once applied it to an IV line, when she had no other option. Not the designed use, but the available one. The lock was not a security lock. It was a convenience lock, the kind designed to keep papers from falling out, rather than to resist a determined person with a blade and 40 years of improvisation experience. It yielded in 4 minutes. Inside the box were 3 things. A stack of folded documents bound with a rubber band. A small brown notebook spiral-bound, the pages dense with handwritten entries. And cash banded in 2 packets which she set to the side without counting it. She took the documents first. She unfolded them and she read in the March mountain light, which was thin and pale but adequate. The sky above the ridge clear in the way of post-storm days in the Rockies, the kind of clarity that came after the weather had said everything it needed to say. The first document was the original deed to the Dunbar homestead, not a copy. The original, the one that had been filed with Garfield County when she and Ward had purchased the land 23 years ago. The one with the county recorder's stamp and the original signatures and the legal description that ran for 3 pages and described the property boundary in the precise language of land law. Ward's signature was at the bottom. She looked at it. W.D. 2 letters, a period. 2 letters, a period. His initials exactly as he had signed everything in his adult life, exactly as his father had signed before him. She looked at the forgery document that Corvin had presented to her in October, which she had been carrying in her memory for 5 months, with the precise retention of a nurse who had learned to hold medical information without distortion. Ward Dunbar, written in full. The looping, careful script of someone who had found out a name, but had not known how it was used. The second document in the bundle was the debt agreement, the one dated November 2019. She read it again carefully. The language of a manufactured debt, the terms designed to appear legitimate, the signature at the bottom that bore no relationship to the signature of the man it was supposed to belong to. She set the documents carefully back into the box. Then she opened the notebook. The first entry was dated February of 2019, not November. February. She read slowly, and she understood as she read that Corvin Vickers had not begun his planning in response to the heart diagnosis. The diagnosis had accelerated. It had moved it from contingency to active. But the foundation had been laid earlier. The first entry described a conversation with Boyd Cutler over what the notebook called an arrangement regarding the eventual disposition of the Dunbar property. The amount agreed upon was specific. The terms were specific. February 2019, 8 months before Ward's diagnosis. She sat with this for a while. She sat with the understanding that Corvin had been planning this before Ward was sick, that he had been building the structure that would eventually be used to take the property, before there was any immediate reason to believe the property would become available. He had simply anticipated. He had looked at the situation, his brother's land and his brother's age and his brother's wife and the trajectory of a life on a mountain, and he had decided to prepare for an outcome he intended to bring about when the moment was right. The payments recorded in the notebook ran from that first entry in February 2019 through December 2023. Regular amounts to Boyd Cutler, documented in the careful shorthand of a man who kept his own accounts. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before October, the month Ward died. She closed the notebook. She placed it in the box with the documents. She put the cash in the box as well, because it was evidence of the amounts and she was not going to take it for any other reason. She latched the box and she put it in the canvas pack. She stood up. She looked at the debris field around her, the avalanche scar, the overturned trees and displaced stone, and the thing at the field's eastern margin that had been Corvin Vickers. She said nothing. She adjusted the pack on her shoulders and she turned south, and she began the descent. The descent took most of the day, not because the distance was great, but because the conditions were what they were. March on the high ridge, the snow unpredictable and the slope demanding, and she was not moving the way she had moved in October when she had come up. She was moving the way a person moved at the end of 5 months of sustained difficulty, with the careful economy of someone who had learned exactly how much she had left and was not going to spend it carelessly. She came out of the timber below the property line in the early afternoon. The cabin was visible from 200 yards, and she stopped when she saw it. She had expected to feel something large when she saw it. She had been thinking about it for months. The specific structure of the building, the pitch of the roof and the way the south windows caught the light, and the particular angle of the porch rail that Ward had gotten right on the second attempt after the first version had been slightly off and bothered him until he rebuilt it. She had thought about all of this in the cave in the long, dark evenings, and she had thought that seeing it again would be a significant event. What she felt was quieter than she expected, not less. Quieter. The cabin was a building. It was a building she had built with her husband and lived in for 20 years, and that had been taken from her by a man who was now dead on the north slope. It was material. It was real. But it was not what she had been. It was not what she was. The building had remained while she had gone away and become something she had not been before. October, something more stripped down and more fundamental. And the reunion between who she was now and the building that had been hers was quiet rather than dramatic, because the building had not changed, and she had. She walked toward it. The door was unlocked. She did not go inside immediately. She stood on the porch for a moment, and she looked at the yard, at the tree line, at the place where the grave marker was visible, at the edge of the property. She looked at the mountains above her Blackwood Ridge and the high country beyond it, where she had been living for 5 months. The particular terrain of it familiar now in the way that intimate familiarity differs from knowledge. The difference between knowing the name of a place and knowing every stone on its floor. She had lived inside that mountain. She had earned its terrain the way things are earned through endurance rather than purchase. She went inside long enough to take what she needed, and then she set out for town. She had thought about the drive, and then she had thought about the condition of the road. The county road would be plowed had certainly been plowed since February, but the track from the cabin down to the county road had not been maintained and might not be passable in the truck, even if the truck started after 5 months of sitting in the cold. She had thought about this and concluded that she was walking into Blackwood Ridge, regardless of what the truck did. Because arriving on foot was not the same as arriving in a vehicle, and the distinction mattered for reasons she could articulate and reasons she could not. She was going to walk into that town the way Ward had told her once, that people used to walk into important situations on this mountain, not on horseback or in a wagon, but on foot. Because arriving on foot meant arriving without the resource of a machine, and therefore arriving as exactly what you were, which was a person who had walked there under their own power and intended to stand in front of whoever needed to be stood in front of. The county road was clear, plowed bare and dry, the gravel showing in the ruts, the evidence of regular traffic in the tire tracks, and the sand that the county trucks had spread on the icy sections. She walked on the shoulder, and she kept a pace that she could maintain without hurrying the pace of a person who was going somewhere and was not in a rush, because she had not been in a rush for the last 5 months and was not going to start now. The town of Blackwood Ridge was 11 miles from the property line. She walked for 3 hours and a little more. She did not count the miles consciously. She counted other things. The birds that had returned to the lower elevation in the past week. The mountain bluebirds that arrived in March in the valley below and worked their way upward, which she had not seen since October. The sound of the creek that ran beside the road in the lower sections, unfrozen now, and running with the sound of accumulated snowmelt, high and fast and purposeful. The particular smell of mud and pine needle and wet stone that was the smell of the Rockies in early spring, a smell she had known since childhood, a smell that was uncomplicated and entirely good. She thought about what she was going to say. She had been composing it since January, the specific words for the specific situation, the way she had always composed important communications in advance and with attention to precision. A nurse who said the wrong thing in the wrong moment could undo a correct diagnosis. A nurse who said the right thing said it once clearly and let it do its work. She arrived in Blackwood Ridge at 4 in the afternoon. The street that ran through the center of town had changed nothing in the 5 months she had been absent. The same buildings in the same positions, the hardware store and the diner and the post office and the small grocery. The same trucks parked in front of the same establishments. She walked through all of it, and she was aware that people were seeing her, that the people on the street and behind the windows were looking at a woman who had not been in this town since October, and who looked different from the last time they had seen her, and who was walking with the quality of someone who had been somewhere and was now back. She did not look at them. She walked to the sheriff's office. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. Boyd Cutler was at his desk. She had known him for 15 years, and she understood his face the way she understood faces after a career of reading them for information. She watched him see her. She watched the sequence of recognition, and then the sequence of what happened after recognition. The particular recalibration of a man who had made a calculation about the probability of a certain event and was now confronting the failure of that calculation in real time. He started to speak. She walked to the desk and she set the metal box on it. He looked at the box. She said, "I did not die." 3 words. She had chosen them in January in the cave when the carbon monoxide had been building, and the ache behind her eyes had been the specific ache of poisoning. and she had pulled herself across the floor to the axe. She had chosen them because they were the precise statement of the situation, and because precision was the thing she had come to believe in above most other things, the quality that separated a useful response from an inadequate one. Boyd Cutler looked at the box, and then at her, and then at the box again. She unlatched the lid and she opened it on his desk and she turned it so the contents faced him. She did not speak for a moment. She let him look. She let him read the situation. The way she had let patients read a diagnosis, giving the information time to settle before the conversation that came next. He said, "Cece." She said, "I need you to call Judge Goss." He said her name again differently. This time, the name carrying the particular weight of a man trying to establish a register for the conversation, trying to find the version of it that was most manageable. She said, "Boyd. Look at the notebook." She said it with the tone she had used for 40 years in emergency situations when a person was not doing the thing they needed to do, and the time available for not doing it was running out. Not loud, not aggressive. The tone of a woman who had been doing difficult things for a long time and understood exactly when the moment for conversation had ended and the moment for action had begun. He looked at the notebook. She watched him read it. She watched his face as he read. She had read faces for 40 years and she knew what she was seeing. She was seeing a man understanding that the structure he had been part of was now visible, that the visibility was not going to recede, and that the options available to him were fewer than he had believed they were an hour ago. She said, "Judge Goss." She said it the way she said necessary things once, clearly, without repetition, because repetition was the language of doubt, and she did not have doubt. He reached for the phone. Judge Rayford Goss arrived at the sheriff's office 45 minutes later. He was 67 years old and had been the county judge for 18 years. And she had appeared before him once, years ago, in a property boundary dispute that had been resolved in her and Ward's favor. He was a precise man, a man who read carefully and spoke carefully and who carried his authority without display, which was the kind of authority she trusted. He read the notebook. He read the debt document with the forged signature. He read the original deed. Then he looked at her for a long time in the way that people who are assessing something important look at it, without rushing the assessment. He said, "Where is Corvin Vickers?" She said, "North slope of the Blackwood property." She told him what she had found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where have you been since October?" She said, "On the mountain." He looked at her and she understood he was taking her in the condition of her, the weight she had lost, and the particular quality of a person who had come through something and was still standing, not despite it, but because of it, which was a different kind of standing. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I need food and a bed and the return of my property." In that order. He almost smiled. It was a small movement, the compression of something more complete than he was going to express in this room, and she recognized it for what it was. A man encountering a situation that was outside his ordinary range of experience and responding to it with the particular restraint of someone who was taking it seriously. He turned to Boyd Cutler. What happened in the next hour was the institutional machinery of justice moving in the way it moved slowly, and with the friction of procedure, but unmistakably in a direction, the accumulation of small formal steps that added up to something that could not be undone. The call to the county attorney, the documentation of the lockbox contents, the formal questions and the formal answers. Cece sat in a chair against the wall, and she watched it happen, and she ate the crackers that someone had found in the desk drawer of the dispatcher's station and had brought to her without being asked because someone had looked at her and understood that she needed to eat. She ate them one at a time, and she watched. Boyd Cutler was disarmed by the county deputy who arrived at 5:20. The disarmament was quiet and procedural, the way such things were done when they were done correctly without theater or unnecessary force. The acknowledgement of a changed situation conveyed through action, rather than words. Boyd Cutler did not resist. He sat in the chair he had been sitting in, and he let the situation become what it had become. Arlene Vickers was brought in for questioning at 6. She arrived in the company of a neighbor who had been called to drive her down from the property, and she arrived with the particular composure of a woman who had been expecting something like this for some time and had made her peace with the expectation. She was not warm when she looked at Cece, but she was not hostile. She was the expression of a woman settling an account that had been open too long. Judge Goss signed the order at 7:15. He handed Cece the key to the cabin. He stood across the desk from her and he held it out, and she took it. And the metal was cold in her hand, the way all metal was cold in March on this mountain. The particular cold of material that had not been near a human body in some time, waiting to warm. He said, "I cannot imagine how you managed it." She looked at him. She thought about the cave, the chimney crack, and the fire she had built under it, and the traps she had set, and the carbon monoxide, and the axe in the dark, and the 5 months of making herself useful in a situation that had been designed to make her useless. She thought about Ward, and what he had given her, not just the knowledge of the mountain, but the patience to apply it, the quality of attention that turned knowledge into use. She thought about the 40 years before the mountain, the careers and the cases, and the long accumulation of a professional life spent keeping people alive in conditions that were trying to kill them. She thought about the forged signature and what it had not known about the person it was trying to erase. She said, "I did not manage it." She paused. She said, "I conquered it." She put the key in her coat pocket. She thanked the judge, and she walked out of the sheriff's office into the March evening, which was cold and clear and smelled of the particular combination of snowmelt and pine and mountain mud that was the smell of this elevation. In this season, the smell of a winter that had spent everything it had and was now releasing its hold on the land. She drove back to the cabin in a truck borrowed from a neighbor who had offered without being asked, who had seen her come out of the sheriff's office and had understood something about the situation without needing it explained. She drove the county road and then the track, and she came up the last rise to the property, and she stopped the truck where she could see the cabin against the sky. She sat in the truck for a while, not because she was uncertain, because she wanted to let the moment be what it was, before it became something ordinary. The ordinary thing of being home which it would become, which it needed to become, which was the goal of everything that had happened since October. She wanted to hold it for a moment in its fullness before it became routine. The cabin was lit by the western sky behind her, the last of the March lights spreading across the high ridge in the orange and pink that followed the sun below the peaks in this season. And the buildings stood in that light, the way buildings built by people who understood their landscape stand as part of the scene rather than against it, shaped by the same forces and made of the same materials. Ward had built it to last. It had lasted. She got out of the truck. She walked to Ward's grave at the edge of the tree line, and she stood there in the last of the light. She did not speak at length. She had said what needed saying that morning on the north slope, and the saying had been what it needed to be, the close of a conversation, rather than the opening of another. She put her hand on the granite marker She said, "I am home." The wind moved through the high pines above the ridge, the particular sound of March wind in the Rockies. Not the killing sound of winter wind, but the sound of wind that was moving air, rather than moving cold air, that carried moisture and the promise of grass, and the particular renewal that came every year to this mountain, regardless of what had happened on it during the winter. The mountain did not care what had happened on it. That was not its nature. Its nature was to continue to apply its logic without preference or judgment, to present its conditions to the people who lived on it, and let those conditions reveal what those people were made of. It had been doing this for a long time before Cecilia Dunbar, and it would do it long after. But she had been on it this winter. She had been on it, and she had not been found wanting, and the mountain had not been an adversary. It had been a test the way Ward had always said it was, and she had passed the test not by defeating the mountain, but by understanding it, by applying the 40 years of accumulated knowledge and the particular attention he had given her, and the 63 years of a life built around being useful in hard situations. She went inside. The cabin was cold, and it smelled of absence, the particular smell of a space that had been closed and empty for months. Dust and the faint mustiness of a place that had not been breathed in. She did not mind it. She had been breathing cave air for 5 months. This was nothing. She found the matches in the kitchen drawer, where they had always been kept. She found the kindling in the box beside the stove, where it had always been kept. She built a fire. She built it the way she had been building fires for 5 months, not with ceremony, but with attention. The small, careful architecture of tinder and kindling and larger wood. The patience of someone who understood that a fire built correctly required nothing further, and a fire built incorrectly required constant management. The fire caught on the first match. She sat on the floor in front of the stove with her back against the hearth, and she let the heat come into her, and she ate the last of the crackers from her coat pocket, and she looked at the room around her. Ward's coffee mug was still on the shelf. His work gloves were still on the peg. She would put them away eventually. She would put them somewhere she could find them, when she wanted them, which would not be often and might not be soon, but would happen because that was how grief worked over time. Not the elimination of the person from the space they had occupied, but the gradual integration of their absence into the ongoing life of the person who remained. She was 63 years old. She had buried her husband and been driven from her home, and spent 5 months in the interior of a mountain, keeping herself alive with the tools a 40-year nursing career and 20 years of mountain life had given her. She had come through a winter that had been designed by the weather and by a man who was now dead on the north slope to end her. It had not ended her. She sat in front of the stove, and she felt the fire doing what fires do, which was to warm the immediate space and make it habitable and push back against the cold that would otherwise enter and fill every available space. The eternal negotiation of warmth and cold that was the basic physics of life at altitude in a place where the winter was serious and the summer was brief, and the spring and fall were the mountain's way of reminding you that the extremes were what it was made of. Outside, the March wind moved across Blackwood Ridge. The stars came out in the way they came out at this elevation abruptly and in quantity, the sky going from pale to dark to crowded with light. In the course of an hour, the particular density of stars visible at 8,000 feet that was never visible at lower elevations. The sky here being closer and more present than in the valley. She sat by the fire. She let the cabin warm. She had work to do, the particular work of beginning again, which was different from the work of survival, in that it was oriented towards something rather than away from something. There would be a conversation with the county attorney about the property documentation. There would be the matter of what had been taken in her absence, and what remained, and what needed to be rebuilt. There would be spring, which came to this mountain with the same indifference and the same beauty it had always brought, and which would require what it always required, the attention and the work of a person who understood what this place needed from the people who lived on it. She was ready for all of it. She had been ready since the morning she had come out of the cave into the March light and stood on the surface of the mountain for the first time in weeks, and looked at the sky and understood that the winter had released her, and that what came next was hers to determine. The fire settled into coals. She did not bank it. She let it burn because she was home, and there was wood stacked outside, and she could afford to let the fire be what it was, rather than managing it toward the future. She leaned her head back against the hearthstones, and she looked at the ceiling of the cabin, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of rest, the particular rest of a mind that had been working at full capacity for 5 months, and was now for the first time free to simply exist, rather than plan and calculate and assess. The wind moved across the ridge outside. The fire burned. Cecilia Dunbar was home, and the mountain was the mountain it had always been, and the winter was over.